Can you really become a millionaire and build a castle starting from nothing with only a fishing rod and an old bicycle? I decided to find out. And this video tells the story of my entire 10-year journey, filled with obstacles, setbacks, and one truly massive goal. Will I make it? Let's find out. So I get on my bike and head out into the world because first I need to earn my very first money. And for that we'll use the most obvious thing, the fishing rod. I may not be the best fisherman, but I believe we'll manage to catch something and make that first small step. The river seems like the perfect place to start fishing. Supposedly it's full of huge fish, not like in the sea. The one tourists, as they say, pee into. Sounds promising, so it's time to start the adventure. Our first serious goal, make 2,000. That's where we'll begin the road to 1,000,000 and to my dream castle. It started off pretty nicely because despite having absolutely no skill, my first catch was a fish worth a clean 100. A moment later I caught another one, this time twice as expensive, and right after that yet another fine specimen. Within a few minutes I had almost half a grand to my name and I was already thinking this was going to be easy. Of course it couldn't stay that perfect. The next catch was a tire. To this day I have no idea how my poor fishing rod was supposed to pull something like that out, but whatever. Luckily fate took pity on me because right after the tire I landed the biggest fish of my short fishing career. $400 in one go. I was already close to halfway to my goal, but you know how it is. After the highs there's always some trash. Literally. Right after that I pulled in another fish for 200, then another one, and just when I thought my luck was back I reeled in a bucket, because why not? And after the bucket something weird I can't even describe. If you know what that is, let me know in the comments because I still have no idea. Fortunately after that streak of junk I hooked another record fish for 400, which got me closer to my goal than anything before. I added another little fish for 100 on top of that and finished with a catch worth 200. And just like that, after all that chaos, my balance finally showed the long-awaited $2,000. After a successful fishing trip, I decided that before I start investing the money I'd earned, I deserved a quick nap in my tent. So I jumped on my bike, went back home, and crashed like a log. After the nap, it was already midday, and I had a little business meeting with Grandpa. We were going to lease a field. This is where the real game for 1,000,000 begins. Yes, you heard that right. I leased a field. And before anyone says that's completely unrealistic, remember that in the real world, farmers really do lease fields to each other for a couple of years. It's a normal thing. And as for that, I'll tell you more in a video about realistic mods that will be coming to the channel soon. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. In the meantime, this is what my rented field looked like. Oats were growing on it, fully ready to harvest. A perfect moment for the harvest. And here I'll surprise you, we're not going to lease any machines. Instead, I bought this little handheld combine for $1,500. For many it's a toy, but for me it's the perfect solution for a freshly leased tiny field. I immediately headed out to the field to harvest the oats. I mowed for a bit and then a thought hit me. I still had some cash left. So I hired a worker to finish the job, and in the meantime I could run to the store for another purchase, a trailer, because somehow we need to sell that grain, right? As soon as I brought the trailer to the field, I ran straight back to the store for yet another purchase, a baler, also a manual one for those tiny little bales. Unfortunately, when I got back to the field with the baler, my worker had already quit. The reason? I was bankrupt again. I had no money left to pay him. So I decided to do exactly what I did before, earn a few extra 100 in my favorite way, so I could afford to hire the worker again. The road to 1,000,000 is never easy, but at least it's interesting. I caught a few fish, some junk, and to my huge surprise, a collectible item that sold for a full 1,000. Thanks to that, my balance went up to almost 1,500, so I had money to keep the worker and calmly continue the work. So I hired him again and got back to baling. The worker quite efficiently filled the first grain tank, so it was time to empty it, and I have to admit, it looked pretty funny. I pulled up with my tiny trailer, and realistic it was definitely not, but the important thing is that it worked. I emptied the tank and went back to work with the baler. I baled all the straw on the field, and when I caught up with the worker harvesting the grain, I parked the boiler to the side and ran to the store for one more purchase. This time a second trailer, specifically for bales. It wasn't expensive, and the comfort it gives you while working is huge. When I got back to the field, the worker already had a full grain tank and was waiting to unload. So I grabbed the trailer and took care of it. He didn't pour much into it. The trailer's capacity is ridiculously small, but it was enough to head to the sell point. For the grain we'd collected so far, I got $2,000, which I consider a really good result, especially given that just moments earlier, we were completely bankrupt. The road to $1 million was finally starting to pick up. I returned to the field and immediately emptied the combine again because the tank was almost full. I waited just a moment and the trailer filled up with grain once again, so I headed back to sell it. Another $2,000 came in. Now things were finally starting to roll. When I came back, I got straight to baling because I had a lot of catching up to do and my worker wasn't slowing down for even a second. After a short while, he was already close to finishing the job, but the tank wouldn't fit everything. So I collected the grain he had stored up and went off to sell it again. And once more, another $2,000 landed in my account. When I returned to the field, the worker had finished the entire harvest and I still had some baling left. I didn't want to leave it for later, so I rolled up my sleeves and finished the job. Once all the straw was baled, I hopped into the combine, emptied the remaining grain into the trailer, and parked the machine to the side. Then I went off to sell the last batch of grain for the season. It didn't sell for much, but overall, I now had over $6,000 on my account. As it turned out, if I had done everything myself, I would have had about $1,500 more. The worker was insanely expensive because he charges by the hour, not by the job. But oh well, you live and learn. I parked all the harvesting equipment, but the field still had bales waiting, and not a few, a lot. But before I started loading them, I ran to the store for another tool, a cultivator, since I needed to prepare the field for sowing. Thankfully, this model wasn't too expensive. The road to $1 million is progressing slowly, but the farm work is getting faster, and it's starting to get really interesting. At first, I planned to immediately hire a worker to prepare the field, but in the end I decided to gather all the bales first and only then move to the field work. You can now make your guesses in the comments about how many bales I managed to fit onto the trailer. I guarantee the result will surprise you. The test turned out to be harder than I thought. At first everything was going smoothly, but then the bales started sliding all over the place, mostly because of my mistake. When I was repositioning the trailer, I didn't strap them down and they just kept shifting. So I decided to stack them all over again, this time as stable as possible, and only then start adding as many as I could on top. But when the bales started falling off the trailer, even with the straps on, I figured that was the moment to finally say, stop. There was no point loading more if I was just gonna lose half of them on the way to the sell point. So here it is, my masterpiece. I honestly lost count of how many bales are on there, so if anyone manages to count them, boast about it in the comments. The trip to the sell point, to my huge surprise, went by without any major incidents. I didn't lose a single bale. Time to find out how much I'll get for all of this, and how much closer it will bring us to that dream million. For selling the bales, I got over $1,600, so the result was really decent, but when I got back to the field, I decided I wouldn't sell any more bales. I parked them to the side. They'll be my safety net in case I ever run out of cash. It's better to have an emergency stash than panic later. Once the field was cleared of bales, I decided to go to sleep to recharge my energy. At dawn the next day, I wanted to get straight to sowing. In the morning, I headed to the store, but not for the bike, which was still standing there, but for another machine, specifically of course a seeder. Also handheld, tiny and cheap, so perfectly suited to my modest budget. For a seeder like this, buying a whole pallet of seed for over $1,000 would be completely stupid. So instead, I stocked up on bags of seed that you can load by hand. Once I'd poured all the seed into the tank, I headed to the field to finally get to work. New day, new task, and every step brings us closer to that million. I started working full steam ahead. I made a few passes with the cultivator, then hired a worker and jumped into the seeder myself so as not to waste a single moment. I won't bore you with just the sowing. It went pretty smoothly, though I have to admit that at one point I even hired a worker to run the seeder so I could take a little break. And just like that, another day passed, or rather another month, because at this pace time in this game flies by insanely fast. Once the sowing was finished, I went to sleep for a few more months. Of course I chose grass. It is a bit of an overused idea because we will be making silage, but we are going to do it in a really true to life way, the way this series deserves. So So I skipped forward a few months until December, when the grass was ready to harvest. And then I headed to the shop for another purchase. And of course, it was a mower, and obviously a small walk behind one. As soon as I dragged it onto the field, I first mowed a bit of the roadsides for the future, because I already had a certain plan. Then I hired a worker and ran off to go fishing. This time though, I only caught 2 fish, so I decided I had to speed up my earnings. My next goal was 15,000, so I decided to take contracts. And not 1, not 2, but 3 of them, with one alone paying over 13,000. With the balance I had at that moment, it looked like absolute millions. Once I delivered the machine to the fields and hired workers to do the contracts for me, I ran off to fish again myself. I wanted to be sure I would have enough money to keep all those people on the payroll, because suddenly I had as many as 4 workers, and that could very quickly lead me straight into another bankruptcy, which, as you know, I would really like to avoid this time. Everything depended on whether I could hold out until the contract payouts came in and whether this time luck would be on my side. The fishing was exceptionally tragic, and not only because the money was disappearing from my account faster than I was earning it from selling fish, but also because I was catching some tiny, miserable specimens. So I quickly wrapped up the fishing and went back to the meadow. When I got there, it turned out that the worker mowing the grass had very little left to do, so I could immediately move on to the next step of the plan. First, however, I collected the money from 2 contracts that had finished during my little fishing vacation. I invested the cash I earned into manual rakes, which at first glance looked like a brilliant idea. Unfortunately, it very quickly turned out that this was not an ideal modification. Even though it came from the official mod hub, after taking 3 steps, I instantly bugged out, but I did not worry about it and somehow made it to the meadow. Once I got there, I discovered that although the rakes looked awful visually, technically they worked. They did their job, which was raking grass. The problem was that the whole process was much slower than I had imagined. Because of that, I quickly put them aside and headed to the shop for yet another purchase. And that purchase was my very first engine on the farm. A tractor. It looked like its best years were way behind it, but hey, it was still better than sprinting around the field like a maniac. And that's how the next stage of organizing this chaotic but increasingly promising farm begins. Besides the tractor, I also bought a forage wagon, which was actually in slightly better shape than the tractor itself. There wasn't a single speck of rust on it, but looks aren't everything, so I headed straight back to the farm to see how all of this would work in practice. When I got to the meadow, it turned out that despite my new toys looking pretty average, technically everything worked perfectly. The grass was disappearing in the blink of an eye, and my legs could finally take a break from all that running. I didn't collect all the grass though, only the side part of the field, just to clean it up and prepare it for construction. And now you're probably asking, what construction if the field isn't even yours, just leased? Well, just please don't tell Grandpa, because he might get a bit upset. Luckily, I managed to level the ground so it looks like the lease agreement technically allows it. Once the area was leveled, I marked out the area for a silo. It's a brilliant modification. You don't have to build a massive bunker silo. You just designate a patch of land and make silage there as if there was a real structure. And the cost? Only $100. Perfect for my budget. This is how everything looked after I was done. Pretty professional, considering it was pure improvisation on someone else's field. Technically, everything worked smoothly too, because I had no trouble at all unloading grass into the silo. So it was time to collect the rest of the meadow, since while I was building, my worker had already finished mowing everything. After a short while of picking up grass, I realized it was a complete waste of time to rake with those bugged rakes. They covered almost the same working width as the forage wagon anyway, so I'd just be doing double the work. So I decided to collect everything raw. I'll admit, it took me a while, but I finally got it done. And of course, in the end, there just had to be some kind of disaster. While I was unloading the last load of grass, I got stuck and couldn't pull the forage wagon out of the silo. Classic. In this series, there always has to be some kind of catastrophe right at the end. So I came up with the idea to detach the forage wagon from the tractor and compact the grass around it properly, so that the grass blocking the wheels would spread out over a larger area. The idea turned out to be brilliant. After a moment, I pulled the wagon out without any problem and could finally get back to compacting our silage so I could cover it. After compacting for quite a while, I understood why bunker silos are so popular. A huge amount of grass spilled outside my makeshift silo, and I had to pick it all up again with the forage wagon, dump it back into the middle of the marked area, and compact everything one more time. I lost a lot of time because of that, but honestly, who wouldn't expect that in this series? Once the grass was 100% compacted, it was time for the ceremonial covering. It quickly turned out I hadn't pushed everything perfectly into the middle. A lot of the material didn't get covered. Oh well, as long as it works. After covering the silo, I collected the last contract that had finished while I was working. Thanks to that, despite all the big purchases, I still ended the day with almost 15,000. After everything was done, I went to sleep so I could deal with selling in the morning. When the grass had fermented and was ready, I pulled off the plastic and, as some of you probably guessed, I used the forage wagon to load the silage. Because it was well compacted, it went quickly. For the first load to the sell point, I got almost 2,300. When I came back for the rest and picked up everything I could uncover, another problem appeared. Part of the silage simply refused to uncover. I approached it from every side, tried to load it, I even restarted the game. Nothing. I couldn't uncover it, so I couldn't load it either. I fought with it for a bit, but eventually decided it wasn't worth the time. So I went to sell what I had managed to dig out and got just over 2,000. And the remaining 6,500 liters of bugged silage. I just spawned in with a command so I could sell it. That also brought me almost 1,500. Summing up the whole sale, it was pretty mediocre considering how much work I had put into it. Even though I was already a bit mechanized at this point, the result left a lot to be desired. And on top of that, there was the bugged silage, and as a result, a broken silo that I couldn't reuse. Everything pointed to one thing. If I really want to make a million and build my dream castle, I need to change tactics fast. So I took some radical steps to get back onto the right track toward that goal as quickly as possible. And the best thing that could help me at that moment was, of course, contracts. I grabbed 3 of them right away. They were pretty poorly paid, but in my situation, I had no right to be picky. I hired workers for all 3 contracts, and surprisingly, this time I didn't go fishing. Instead, I ran to my machine yard and started selling everything one by one. For most of the machines, I got basically pennies because I bought them for only slightly more, so it wasn't some dramatic loss. The biggest payout came from selling the combine. Yes, I sold that too before anyone asks. What's more, I even sold the seeder, the bugged rakes, and one of the most expensive things on my entire farm. Not the tractor, but the forage wagon. After all that, I was left with just one machine, the tractor. The rest of my assets went under the hammer. Once I had cleared the farm of most of the equipment, I went back out to the fields to finish the contracts myself. I didn't want to waste money on workers when I could be doing something on my own. After completing all the jobs, I collected the payment, and as you might expect, it wasn't exactly millions. But hey, it was something. After all that, I fast-forwarded time to April, when more interesting contracts finally appeared. This time fertilizing contracts, 3 of them in total. I accepted all of them. I hired workers for 2 and did 1 myself. Fertilizing is fertilizing. It went smoothly. In the end, I didn't make a fortune because after subtracting the cost of fertilizer, the profit was pretty small. But that amount should still be more than enough to build a new strategy. The first thing I did was lease the neighboring field where I had previously noticed grass growing. I also bought 2 mowers and a windrower. All of them old, but not nearly as old as the next rusty tractor I purchased. After sending the tractors with hired workers to mow the meadows, I began a massive contract grinding session. Most of them were fertilizing contracts handled by workers, but I still had plenty to do myself. During that time, I completed 2 log transport contracts and 2 bale wrapping contracts. And those contracts I did personally paid extremely well. While I was grinding through the contracts, the workers managed to mow and rake the meadows with a bit of help from me along the way. And once everything was ready for collection, I of course bought a baler and a wrapper. Both machines were also very old, but most importantly, their power requirements were a perfect match for my ancient tractors. When I got back to the meadow, I fired up the good old trick everyone knows. I was baling myself, and the tractor behind me, controlled by the Follow Me mod, was immediately wrapping the bales as they came out of the baler. You could say everything was working great. It looked smooth, logical, and pretty professional. The problem was that it was an insanely tedious and long process. Baling those 2 meadows took me about an hour and a half. It might not sound too terrible, but remember that the meadows themselves weren't that big, so it depends how you look at it. Anyway, after a long and exhausting grind, everything was finally nicely baled and wrapped. But to actually sell it, I still needed a bit of extra cash for one more purchase, so I took on 3 new contracts. 2 fertilizing jobs, for which I of course hired workers, and 1 log transport contract that naturally I had to handle myself. At first I didn't even notice that this time I didn't get an extra log trailer like before. It only hit me when I arrived at the site and saw how much wood I had to take. I have to admit, this was definitely the most skill-based task so far. Despite the very improvised log arrangement, I managed to deliver everything to the destination. Once I unloaded it, I could collect the payment for all 3 contracts, which brought my balance up to almost $25,000. At that point, the real fertilizing contract marathon began. I was taking them in batches, sending workers out into the fields, and just handling the logistics myself. Anyway, after finishing those contracts, I had a little over $35,000 on my account, so I could finally say I was ready. So I headed to the store for another machine bought with my hard-earned money. The new machine looked like the most modern purchase on my farm so far. Of course, it wasn't a brand new model or anything, but for the price I got it for, I really couldn't complain. In theory, my old tractor met the power requirements to run this machine. In practice, on a field with slight hills, it struggled a bit. Luckily, it just about managed, and I was able to collect everything, or rather, fill the trailer to the brim. It held exactly 21 bales, and once it was packed full, I headed to the biogas plant to finally cash in all that hard work. The sale came out to around $14,000. Not exactly the best news considering how much time and effort I'd put into it. So I wiped away a little tear and went back to the meadow for the remaining bales. In the meantime, a rather unusual idea popped into my head. I saw a contract for mowing grass and just couldn't resist taking it to check whether I could also mow my own meadow with it. As you can probably guess, or maybe not, it didn't work. I was immediately stopped by a message saying I couldn't just use those mowers on my own field. As a consolation, I decided at least to use the tractor from the contract to pick up the rest of the bales. That way, my poor old tractor could finally take a little break, or rather, its engine didn't have to overheat from hauling so many bales. For the next full trailer, I also received around $14,000. There were still a few bales left in the field, but before going back for them, I picked up 2 more of my favorite contracts. Of course, fertilizing. I sent the tractors where they needed to go and then returned for the remaining bales and collected them calmly. For the last batch of bales, I got a little over $6,000. So in total, I earned roughly $34,000. A very average result, considering that I made more from contracts alone in the meantime. Still, I didn't give up on this method. I parked the bale trailer in my improvised machine yard, and the contract tractor with the mower was sent back where it actually belonged, with a worker hired to finish the job for me. Meanwhile, while the contracts were running, I hooked up my own mower to my tractor and headed to the store to sell it. I decided it was the main reason everything had taken so long, so it was finally time for an upgrade. And as we all know, upgrading requires cash. So when the previous fertilizing contracts finished, I took 2 more. One was of course the beloved fertilizing job, and the other was a mowing contract. I sent all the tractors to the assigned fields and hired workers. At the same time, using the follow me mod, I drove 2 tractors to the store. One was towing the mower and the other the windrower, which I also decided to sell because its performance really didn't satisfy me. Once the machines that had been slowing me down were sold, one of the contracts finished, and I decided to finish mowing the grass myself on the other one that was still in progress. It was a fairly quick job, but one of the contracts was still dragging on and had quite a bit left to do, so I sped up time to wait for more interesting offers. Luckily that worked, and new fertilizing contracts appeared, my favorites. So I grabbed 2 more. When all the contracts were finally completed, my balance had reached $63,000. I bought new mowers, this time very modern ones. Here someone might ask, how on earth is my old tractor supposed to handle that, considering it doesn't even have a front hitch? Well, relax, I had a plan. Earlier, when I tried using a mower from a contract, you know that didn't work out. But when I attached the contract tractor to my mower, everything worked perfectly. So putting 1 and 1 together, I took a new contract, but this time I decided to use the tractor assigned to that contract for my own work instead. I know some of you might not like this because technically I wasn't supposed to be borrowing machines, but if this playthrough is going to grow and actually move forward, I need to get a little creative. I'm doing it with you in mind, long, so it's fun to watch, and the story keeps progressing, so I hope you'll forgive me for this one. Besides the contract from which I stole the tractor, I took on one more, but that one I sent where it was supposed to go. Then I made another big purchase, a modern windrower. It wasn't the biggest one, but it was perfect in terms of power requirements, so my old tractor could handle it. And thankfully, it handled it great. The worker mowing my meadow was also doing a great job. By the time I arrived with the new windrower, the first part was already cut. It was the smaller meadow, sure, but it still went very smoothly. So I sent him straight over to the neighboring meadow to quickly mow that one as well. Meanwhile, I didn't start raking the cut grass right away, because I had a slightly different plan. While the worker was mowing the second meadow, I picked up another contract that I had to handle myself. I drove the tractor to the store, this time not to sell something, but to buy. I'm talking about a fertilizer spreader, because I hadn't fertilized my meadows before. The spreader was small, so instead of buying a huge fertilizer pallet, I grabbed a few small bags and poured them in by hand. After all that, I was left with only about $1,500 on my account, so the plan was simple: don't go bankrupt. I rushed to the meadow and hired a worker to start fertilizing. It might seem a bit crazy with a balance that low, but remember, spreading can be done by a worker, unlike baling, which I had to do myself. So I quickly got to work baling the straw. I have to admit, it wasn't as quick a job as it first seemed, even though I had a square baler. So I didn't have to stop every moment to form bales. The field turned out to be quite large. While I was slowly grinding through the straw baling, one worker managed to finish mowing the second meadow, and the other had already spread fertilizer on the smaller one and moved on to the bigger meadow to finish fertilizing it before I was done. After a long baling session, I finally managed to complete the contract and got over $8,000 for it. At long last, it was time for the grand finale of my brilliant new strategy. After parking the fertilizer spreader where it belonged, I hooked the windrower up to my tractor. Behind the windrower, using the Follow Me mod, I set up a worker with the baler, and right behind him, also with Follow Me, a worker with the wrapper. This way, I created a fully autonomous silage production convoy that, in theory, would let me scale everything later and finally earn that long-awaited million. In the meantime, while the workers were neatly baling straw, the buses got stuck next to the meadow again, a phenomenon that happens way too often on this map. I don't know if this is what traffic in Scotland really looks like, or if it's just a map bug. If you know, feel free to let me know in the comments. One thing I do know, it definitely wasn't intentional when the worker with the wrapper drove straight onto a bale, because of course nothing can ever be perfect. And speaking of imperfections, the windrower worker also bugged out, this time on that cursed little fence that stands next to most fields. I was afraid this could seriously mess up my brilliant plan, but I was hoping it wouldn't be a total disaster. To keep earning and avoid just standing around while the workers handled the silage, I took another contract, this time for stone picking. Interestingly, I hired a worker for that job, but at the same time I picked up another contract, harvesting peas, which meant I had to work manually and unload the combine myself. I delivered all the vehicles to their assigned fields and later checked on my meadow, only to be greeted by a completely inexplicable catastrophe. I have no clue what happened there. If you have any theories, post them in the comments. My guess was that the meadow was simply too small for that many machines and workers. Even though there was still some grass left, I decided to move everything to the larger meadow, hoping there would be fewer problems. Meanwhile, I unloaded the stones into the trailer. There weren't many, barely half a field's worth. Unfortunately, I can't say the same about the peas. The combine didn't even make a full loop before the tank was full. The field was absolutely massive. When the pea harvest worker called out again that the tank was full, I realized there was no point continuing that contract. It would take me an eternity and the payment wasn't worth the effort at all. So I left the trailer on the field and went to execute the plan that had sparked in my mind. The plan was simple: use the contract tractor for baling on my farm and send the tractor that had been baling earlier to its proper contract location. It sounded genius, in theory. In practice, the workers, despite the huge meadow, were still bugging out, getting stuck on walls, on fences, and even on each other. Honestly, at this point, I was getting a bit crushed, but you can't give up. So I kept fixing the workers and went to finish the stone picking contract. That one actually went smoothly, and I got over $4,500 for it. A very decent payout. In the meantime, the wrapper ran out of foil. so I rushed to the store to restock. Of course, I didn't buy a whole pallet again, just a few rolls. I finished baling the grass on the meadow, and even though it was yet another long task, this time it went noticeably faster than before. In the end, everything was baled and wrapped. While I was doing that, a worker completed a contract, probably the biggest one so far, and I got over 10.5 thousand for it. A very solid bonus. All that was left was to finish the P contract I had decided to abandon. But when I completed it, it turned out I was hit with a penalty of over 14,000 for theft. I didn't even commit. I was completely devastated. Everything was in the tank and in the trailer I'd returned. And yet the game treated me like I'd stripped the field bare and still ended up in the red. That was the last straw. It was honestly getting really hard to keep pushing through this masochistic series. From the start, I tried to stick to tiny machines, not lease equipment, avoid autoloads, play more realistically, and the game just kept throwing obstacles at me. First the bugged silage, then workers driving into walls on the base map, and now a theft penalty for something I didn't even do. So I decided one thing: enough! I will reach my dream million and I will build that castle, no matter what. So I took the final step. Something that simply had to work. But before that, there was one last bit of work to do. Sell the bales I prepared earlier and then sleep until they finished fermenting. Once they were ready, I headed to the sell point with the first load. I earned just over 14,000, basically the same as last season. Nothing special. So I went for the next load. This time I got 13,600. Again, nothing to be excited about. In the end, I was left with 4 bales, one of which had just been wrapped. And only when I reached the sell point did it hit me that it still needed to ferment. Luckily, the sell point doesn't accept grass, so I could just leave it there. And as soon as it matures, it'll sell automatically. No loss, no sadness. After coming back, I parked all the machines on my makeshift yard. The yard wasn't really mine, but the machines were, and you could say they were finally pretty solid. However, if I wanted to earn that million, I had to take every possible step, even the ones that some people might consider very unconventional. So, greenhouses. I know not everyone will be happy about this, but I wanted to finish this series without boring you with yet more hours of mowing. Greenhouses were simply the best solution. Of course, greenhouses need water, and for water you need a tanker. So I went to the store and bought a brand new water tank, the smallest one available, perfectly sized for my tractor, at least visually, because unlike the tractor, it didn't have a single speck of rust on it. As you can probably guess, next to the greenhouse I placed a rice field. And yes, you're thinking correctly. With the right placement of the water tank, I created a money generator. My only job was to supervise it. Just to be safe, I set up my tent right next to it so I could keep everything under control. In the greenhouse, I set it to produce lettuce and sell it automatically, and then I went to sleep. After a few months, when my balance reached around 40,000, I bought another identical water tank and built a second greenhouse with a rice patch. That way, I now had 2 money generators that together were bringing in from 8 up to even 10,000 per month. To cut costs even further, I canceled the lease on the second meadow, which I did not need anymore anyway. And then I went into a long winter sleep. When I woke up, my account showed over 105,000, so it was time to continue executing my new master plan. And I will probably surprise you here because it was not about placing more greenhouses, but buying a farm. As the saying goes, if you are going crazy, do it properly. So I bought a farm for 100,000 and then sold all the buildings that were on it. That gave me over 200,000. And that was not all. I also sold the land itself for the same amount I had paid for it. As a result, I turned 100,000 into more than 300,000. Some will say this is cheating. I will say it is just clever use of game mechanics. Practically everything I earned in this slightly shady but still legal way, I invested into expanding my money production. I placed 5 new greenhouses with rice fields, bought 5 water tanks and 5 tractors, which I dragged over to the farm using Follow Me. You have to admit, the sight of that tractor procession looked really interesting. In this simple way, I'd built myself a machine that was generating over 45,000 a month. Long story short, earning $1 million was now just a matter of time. But the million was only half of the goal. I still had to build the castle. Since I'd taken the easy route with the million, I couldn't exactly do it differently with the castle, so I didn't. After a few more months, when my balance passed $500,000, I took the next step. I bought a truck, a pallet trailer, and set set off to get another piece of the puzzle, a forklift that you can use for free on this map. A little fun fact for those who didn't know, there were a few minor issues getting the forklift onto the trailer, but after a while I managed to sort everything out and headed toward a place many people probably don't even know exists. There's something like a construction store there, completely unmarked on the map, and yet it's fully available in the base game. You can buy all the materials needed for building there, and of course I decided to take full advantage of that. In just a few moments, my trailer was packed with planks and stones needed for the castle. I strapped everything down and drove to the construction site, where I was surprised yet again. The game took all the materials at once, even though I was sure it would only use what was needed for the current stage. But like I said, I'd never built anything in this game before, and definitely not a castle. In the end, it turned out to be good news, because instead of driving back and forth, I could just overstock everything in advance. So I did a bit of research on exactly how many materials were needed for the entire construction, and started loading everything up step by step. First, I filled the trailer to the brim with wood materials. Then I added even more wood and some stone, and to my surprise, I still had some planks left on the trailer. Either something was broken, or my research on the exact material requirements wasn't the best. I decided not to get rid of those extra planks, which, as it later turned out, was a very good decision. On top of the remaining planks, I loaded the stones needed for the castle and some cement. When I arrived at the site, once again, not everything was taken by the construction, so I decided to leave that for later too. On top of all that, I added the roofing, which, interestingly, was taken in full. When, at least in theory, everything needed was already on site, it was time for a long winter sleep. It lasted roughly a year, because I went to bed at the end of year 5, and in year 6 my account showed over 1 million. First goal officially completed. The castle construction was also moving along really fast, and like I mentioned earlier, it was a great decision not to sell the leftover materials, because later on they were used in the following stages of the build. What's more, I actually ran out of stone, so I had to buy 10 more pallets and rush them over because the work had completely stopped. Later, I was still missing some roofing, a bit of cement and some planks, so I delivered a few more loads as well. What matters most is that the castle was finally completed after a total of 10 in-game years. And as they say, a king without a horse isn't really a king. So I bought a small stable and a beautiful steed, so I could ride around my castle like a true ruler. And at last, I could put on the crown, which some of you will probably say I earned with some rather questionable tricks. But I believe I didn't cheat anything in. I just cleverly used what the game offers and fought hard for all of it. If you enjoyed this series, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes, and let me know in the comments what new challenges you'd like to see next, and see you soon.